So our final paper is to be given by Elizabeth Schellekens, and Elizabeth is Chair Professor of Aesthetics in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Uppsala. And prior to moving to Uppsala, how long ago? 8 years ago?
No, 5.
5 years ago, was a professor at Durham University in the United Kingdom. And she was principal investigator for a research project on aesthetics, the aesthetics and ethics of archaeology at Durham. And now she's leading a research network at Uppsala on cultural heritage in peace and armed conflict. She's written extensively on aesthetics and is the author of Aesthetics and Morality and Who's Afraid of Conceptual Art, which she authored with Peter Goldie. And she's published a whole number of articles on a wide range of philosophical, predominantly aesthetic matters. She's also the joint editor of the British Journal of Aesthetics. So it's wonderful to have Elizabeth here all the way from Sweden, and she's going to talk to us today about beauty, destruction, and the Temple of Bel. Please welcome Elizabeth Schellekens.
Thank you very much, Ivan and Anne and everybody else involved in this wonderful workshop. It's been a pleasure to be here, both yesterday and today, at the MoVA and today here. I'm afraid it's a tall order to to uphold the quality of the papers here, but I will do my very best. And it's a bit of a shame that, in a way, my paper talks about the active damaging or destroying or destruction of cultural heritage to begin with, but I hope to end on a more kind of positive note. But I will begin my paper by showing a brief clip to do, well, here it is. Let's just let the clip speak for itself.
I'm Fred Hebert. I'm the National Geographic Archaeology Fellow. This has been a pretty bad week for cultural heritage. We've seen a lot of videos of the destruction of museums in Iraq and Syria. In the Mosul Museum are a lot of very important reliefs, carved stone sculpture, biblical in age, world renowned in their beauty and their significance. When a sculpture gets destroyed, you lose a tangible aspect of humanity. You're seeing something that was made by people thousands of years ago. Unfortunately, the targeting of ancient artifacts that are known around the world is something that people do when they're angry and they're trying to send a message out. We saw that happen in Afghanistan with the destruction of the giant Buddhas, and now we're seeing it in Iraq. But it doesn't convey the message that they are being successful in erasing human history or changing the perspective on humanity. That's impossible to do. Human history is there, it's permanent, it's part of all of our heritage, shared heritage around the world. At the end of the day, we will put the pieces back together today with our local counterparts in Iraq, in Syria, as we do in Egypt and Afghanistan. The most important thing that we can do as global citizens here in the United States or around the world is to be aware that these unrenewable cultural resources like archaeological sites or sculptures belong to all of us. It's all part of human history. And that when we see the destruction of something that's as far away as northern Iraq, it's part of our heritage and it's part of our concern. And we should care about those artifacts and that history because it's our history too.
Right. So these sentiments expressed here by the National Geographic Archaeology Fellow Fred Hebert are echoed across the world in the face of the destruction of cultural heritage artifacts and sites. So Irina Bokova, the previous Director General of UNESCO, released the following statement a couple of years ago. Protecting heritage is inseparable from protecting populations because heritage enshrines people's identities. Heritage gives people strength and confidence to look to the future. It is a force for social cohesion and recovery. And again, the United Nations Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property in the Event of Armed Conflict declares that damage to cultural property belonging to any people whatsoever means damage to the cultural heritage of all mankind. Now, if this is true, cultural heritage, wherever its location or whichever culture produced it, belongs to us all, at least in some sense of the word. And surely no one is left unmoved by the images of destruction of the wonderful artifacts at the Museum of History at Mosul, the stunning Temple of Bel in Palmyra, or the burning of ancient manuscripts in Timbuktu. It's certainly true that historical artifacts and sites belonging to our cultural heritage matter deeply to most of us. When we engage with them, we feel that we gain something. When we preserve or conserve them, we feel that we do something right. When we damage or destroy them, we feel that we lose something. Something we, however geographically or culturally distant we might be, ought to have ensured the survival of. The moment that the sledgehammer defaces the beautiful sculpture, or that one piece of very carefully crafted scripture is destroyed by fire, we feel that we have lost something irreplaceable, something which says something about who we are, perhaps both as members of a community, smaller or wider, and as individuals. As bystanders, we have failed to do something to prevent this destruction. But who has been wronged here, or what has been wronged, and why? So one of the questions that I've been asking myself the last few years is how we should understand this phenomenon, our reaction. One thing we know for sure is that our normative phenomenology is very messy in this context. So according to the International Council on Monuments and Sites, our relation to cultural heritage artifacts and sites is best explained in terms of this so-called heritage cycle. As you can see, by understanding, we will value something. By valuing it, we will want to care for it. By caring for it, we will help. We will enjoy it, and by enjoying it, we will want to know more about it. And so this heritage cycle goes round and round. So it feeds on a knowledge of artifacts, sites, or practices of cultural heritage, and leads to an understanding or insight into ourselves and one another. Now, from a philosophical perspective, there is plenty to reflect on here. And my view is that this cycle is roughly right, actually, insofar as it involves understanding, something that I place as crucial in any aesthetic appreciation, valuing, caring, and enjoying, or what we might call more technically perhaps appreciating. And in my work in this field, I have focused on what you might call the obligations, or some kind of binding relation, or perhaps moral relation more broadly, in which we seem to stand to beautiful artifacts or sites that form part of our cultural heritage and that face damage or destruction in this kind of way. And more specifically, I've looked at three questions. The first is, what is the value of cultural heritage? And by that I mean, how can we best explain the different kinds of value which we ascribe, or perhaps ought to ascribe, to cultural heritage, in order to better understand why we so resist the damage or destruction of cultural heritage and our sense of duty to conserve or safeguard it. And importantly, how do these kinds of value interact with each other in a particular artifact, for example, in order to affect the historical artifacts or sites' overall value? So how do they interact in the production, if you like, of the artifact's overall value? And in what terms might you best describe that overall value? Of course, it's easy to assume that cultural heritage has value per se, and with the addition of a few caveats, I think that's a reasonable position to defend, of course. But merely being part of our cultural heritage doesn't necessarily entail being a desirable or a positively valuable thing simpliciter. Because, of course, plenty of terrible things also form part of our cultural heritage, right? So female mutilation, all over the world, or propaganda art, such as, for example, the White Army's 1919 caricature of Trotsky. So if we keep the idea that cultural heritage is somehow intrinsically valuable, but at the same time think of various aspects or interactions with that heritage as wrong or reprehensible in some sense, then how do we account for the often highly complex combinations of valences in terms of value, such as, say, a negative moral value together with a positive aesthetic value? And again, how does that affect the overall value? You might recognize here the Tempelhof Airport in Berlin. A second aspect of my research has to do with the following concern. To whom or what precisely do we owe the conservation or safeguarding of our cultural heritage? So who might we be failing, or what might we be failing? So I think possible candidates here include, and of course these are not mutually exclusive, past peoples, right? So you might think that that's the case, for example. I'll mention these examples, but I don't have time to talk about them very much. I'll assume that you might have heard of them, but I can talk about them more in discussion or later if you like. Past peoples, such in the Cecil Rhodes statue case at Oriel College in Oxford, where a statue was called to be removed because the person depicted in the statue had wronged past peoples. Also the narrative of history and securing that narrative's continuation, possibly for future generations. So Caroline showed a picture of the Starry Moss Bridge. So it seemed important then to reconstruct the bridge so that there would be no break in the continuation of the narrative, that these have always been two different peoples on either side of this bridge, but which have lived happily together and peacefully together. Another possible candidate might be some group of which we would be non-members, towards which we might feel the need to compensate or repair, or perhaps even ask for forgiveness, if you like, by staging a cultural or moral reunification. Okay, I think here perhaps of the Elgin marbles. But I also think that there are entities such as moral belief systems which can be wronged in this context. And if you recall the video clip we saw at the beginning, and the destruction by ISIL of the artifacts in the History Museum in Iraq, from when I first saw that clip, it looked to me that here's a group of people who just went into a museum and went berserk and broke everything in that museum. But that is far from the case. This was a highly staged event. The particular rooms where the objects were going to be destroyed had been selected and carefully discussed beforehand, and the objects that were destroyed belonged to a culture that were ideologically opposed to ISIL. So it seems to me that in that kind of case, a moral belief system can be wronged also. And in fact, I think there are further candidates, and I'll return to that here, which do not involve people as such, if you like. Okay. A third question I've discussed in my work is the role of aesthetic value in all this. And more specifically, and of course connecting this with the first challenge mentioned earlier, how are we to understand the relation between historical value, moral value, and aesthetic value in our relations to cultural heritage and sites? So this comes back to the question of the different kinds of value we can ascribe to an artifact and how they can or might not be able to interact in an artifact. So assuming that the historical value is in some sense a more stable form of value in this context, you might think that there are at least two ways in which you can approach this question, right? First, perhaps from the moral to the aesthetic. And then you might ask, how, if at all, is the aesthetic appreciation of a cultural heritage artifact or site influenced by the moral concerns that arise in relation to it? So, for example, does it make sense to our aesthetic appreciation of Stonehenge whether human sacrifice was practiced here or not? So if there has been human sacrifice here, does it make it harder for us to appreciate this aesthetically? Does the moral connotations or associations, in a sense, kind of block us from enjoying this aesthetically or not? But also, from the aesthetic to the moral. And in fact, that's the kind of relation that interests me most. So how, if at all, are our moral relations influenced by the artifact's aesthetic value? And why? Right. So to clarify that, does it make a difference to our moral relation with the stele of Hammurabi that it contains this remarkably harsh code of conduct, including laws stating that if a sister of a god enter a tavern to drink, then shall this woman be burned to death. Okay, on the previous section. So there are quite a selection of passages on the stele of Hammurabi which read like that. But it looks like this. And so we might have a tendency to forgive its moral content because it's an aesthetically valuable object. It seems to me that sometimes the more time has passed, the easier it becomes for us to let the moral aspect fade into the background and enjoy them as objects of aesthetic appreciation. Whereas if it's kind of recent history, that becomes harder, and I wonder why that is the case. So do we owe it to aesthetically valuable heritage artifacts and sites to safeguard them in virtue of their aesthetic value? Now, I've promised to talk about the Temple of Bel, and I think reflecting on that case renders some of these philosophical questions more concrete. So as most of you will know, in May 2015, the so-called Palmyra Offensive was initiated by ISIL in an attempt to make substantial military gains in the war against the Syrian army by capturing Tadmur, or modern Palmyra. The district of Tadmur had by then long been of strategic importance to both sides of the conflict due to its position in central Syria. And although it's still not exactly clear precisely which buildings were destroyed by ISIL in the original offensive and which parts were destroyed by the Russian airstrikes supporting the Syrian army and trying to recapture Palmyra from ISIL, considerable damage was inflicted on the site, including the Temple of Bel, which had been a UNESCO World Heritage Site since 1980. Now, there are many reasons why the Temple of Bel has made a lasting impression on many of us, and in some sense epitomized the way in which the act of destroying aesthetically valuable historical sites consciously is an act of aggression in its own right in armed conflict. And one such reason is the arresting beauty of the remaining sections or parts of the temple set against the bare sky like a work of art rising from the ground, commanding us to admire the craftsmanship and resulting aesthetic effect. Another reason relates to the chilling yet arresting vulnerability of the few blocks and columns left standing in this desolate place, the empty space serving as a tangible reminder, if you like, of all the beauty that has been lost alongside what now remains. Connected to this are the many events we know to be true of the temple's history, both past and recent, and the many layers of culturally, religiously and morally charged dimensions that form a part of what the site was and still is today. Perhaps less well known is, for example, the fact that the temple was converted into a Christian church during the Byzantine era under some resistance of the local population, and then subsequently parts of the structure were modified by Arabs in 1132 who converted the temple into a mosque, and at one point the temple courtyard also held mud brick houses amongst the ruins and served as a fortified citadel. So if one's aesthetic appreciation of the material objects which make up the ruin of the Temple of Bel treats these objects merely as that which meets the eye, then there is an important sense in which our engagement with it fails to be an aesthetic encounter with the ruin of the Temple of Bel, qua World Heritage Ruin. Appreciated appropriately, the ruin encompasses a complex combination of narratives, values, and properties. Failing to attend to these entails failing to meaningfully engage with the object of appreciation. And this failure is in large part a failure to view the individual objects on its own terms, I think. To properly engage with an artifact such as a Temple of Bel at Palmyra must involve some direct reference to the highly complex set of relational properties which makes it what it is, the human effort and physical sacrifice put into the original building, the integrity of the persons responsible for its materialization, the ways of life around which the social and religious sites were organized, the manner, more or less aggressive, in which the site was converted and converted again and damaged at several points in its history, the suffering endured in name of this building, and more. It seems to me then that there are in fact two instances of aesthetic value at play in a case such as this. The first is the more formal aesthetic character, if you like, which is in this instance the strong elegance of the lines, the imposing symmetry of what remains of the structure. In other words, the beauty which we can perceive without significant knowledge or understanding of the factors I mentioned a minute ago. And the second, in some respects more significant, is the aesthetic value which emerges from the many other qualities or relational properties which can rightly be ascribed to the object of appreciation, including its many historical features, the morally charged aspects of what this building has meant to different people, good and bad, and why, and also the formal aesthetic qualities, some of which are still visible today. So these two manifestations of beauty or aesthetic value can coexist along one another. They are distinct because the qualities upon which they depend are not the same. In fact, in the second case, one of the determining set of qualities can be the first one. So the beauty of the material object is the first kind I mentioned. You might think of this as perceptual beauty or formal beauty. It's accessible via sense perception. It's dependent on qualities such as color, geometrical composition, and it might be the beauty that you might think of as the kind of traditional, more conventional form of aesthetic value that we can encounter through first-hand perceptual experience with the object of appreciation. The second beauty is what you might call a non-perceptual beauty, and I call it the beauty of the individual object. So the contrast here is with the material object and with the individual object. And there is some allusion here to treating the object as an individual with its own narrative and history. But there are other important things to say about that distinction. Maybe we can come back to that. But in this kind of beauty, we have a much more a broader base of qualities upon which the aesthetic value is dependent, and it is fundamentally linked to an understanding of what the object is. It's not a beauty which is accessible merely via sense perception, but rather through engaging with the object's historical value, moral value, etc. The strength and complexity of these different evaluative qualities will vary, but will interact and all have their different effect on how, and now I'm talking kind of metaphorically, but on how brightly the object of appreciation shines, so to speak. The effect it has on us, or how rich it feels, and quite literally, sometimes its aesthetic weight. Understood along these lines, the beauty or aesthetic value of the individual object can become a candidate for that to which we owe safeguarding or conservation. It is the beauty which results from the dignity of those who have suffered, the self-sacrifice of those who have set the temple before their own lives, the joy of those celebrating their faith there, the pride and care of those who looked after it, together with many other factors, including its age, the degree of difficulty of constructing this building at the time it was made originally, and all the formal aesthetic qualities that it carries. And I think this is somehow very kind of part of our awareness of it when we see these ruins as somehow that there's a part of a story here, there's a kind of triumph or victory in the fact that they have remained, perhaps through some of these hardships. So I'll just conclude by briefly mentioning some of the advantages of this approach of kind of thinking of these objects as having two coexistent forms of beauty or aesthetic value. The first is fairly obvious. It's that it seeks to incorporate the way in which the aesthetic value of cultural heritage artifacts and sites can't helpfully be separated from other evaluative qualities possessed by that work. And as we know from cases such as the Cecil Rhodes statue in Oxford, as I mentioned a minute ago, standing in complicated moral relations to culturally appropriated historical artifacts really does affect the aesthetic value we experience them as having. Not always, but often. Secondly, that at least at times, the full weight of an aesthetic experience of an object of appreciation reaches us sometime after we've had that first kind of perceptual encounter with it. So that seeing, if you like, how all the pertinent evaluative qualities affect one another and fit in with together can take time, and it can change over time. At least partly because this is a process which is fundamentally connected to the gaining of insights and reflection on those insights and that understanding. Connected to that, of course, is the idea that our aesthetic experiences of such works can now continue to alter with time as our relations, such as our moral relations, perhaps change. So our moral commitments might change, and as a result, our experience of its beauty might change. And finally, I think it's a beginning of a story about how the formal beauty, or the perceptual beauty, if you like, can deteriorate, whilst the non-perceptual beauty can remain or even increase. Thank you.